So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to this session where I'm going to talk about statistics and mixed methods analysis using MAXQDA. We'll talk about some of the mixed methods features, so those are available under the mixed methods tab, and then we'll talk about the stats package as well, because I think the two really go hand in hand, or at least they can. I'm Tim, and I'm at the University of Michigan, where I'm Associate Director of our Mixed Methods program and also a faculty member. Please use the chat function, the Q&A function, to ask any questions you have, and then I'll try to save time at the end so that we can go over your questions, and I'll address everything that I can. So here are a few of the features that I am going to cover. First, starting with just the use of variables and the use of variables from sort of the textual and image analysis side, more of the qualitative side, and then also how that translates to some of the stats features as well, and we'll walk through that. I will talk about some of the mixed method specific features, focusing on crosstabs, the interactive quote matrix, qualitative themes by quantitative groups, and then statistics by qualitative groups as well. So you have access to these slides. It's in the chat. You can download that. If you have any trouble with that, you can send me an email as well. My email is on the slide set. I'll put it in the chat, and I'd be happy to get that to you afterwards. So my plan is to go through some slides, and that's more for you, just so that you have something to refer back to. But then we'll periodically switch back and forth to MAXQDA, working off a real project, real data that's been identified, one of my larger studies actually, as we demonstrate some of these features. So first, I just want to talk about working with variables. And I'll focus on document variables. So you can add document variables to your MAXQDA file. And a document variable will essentially be attached to every document that's appearing within your document system. So you can bring in things like demographic characteristics, or if you're doing more of a mixed method study and you have scores or test results or other types of data, maybe from surveys or something else, you can import that as well, and you can attach it to each of those documents. So if a document is an interview with someone, you can attach variables to that as well. And I think that that's important because it actually unlocks a lot of these additional analysis features that we'll talk about going forward. And that was some of those mixed methods features that I mentioned. So you can add document variables manually. We'll look at these in just a moment. You can also export from a file. So if you have your data stored elsewhere in a spreadsheet, if you have data that's in a survey program and you can get it into a spreadsheet or a CSV file, you can get to a point where you can import that really easily into MAXQDA. You can also establish a type of variable, so you're not limited to just integer. It could be Boolean, it could be a text variable, it could be a categorical variable. We'll look at some of those in just a moment as well. And one benefit, and there are many benefits of working with variables and adding to them, is that it does allow you to then activate your documents based on variables as well. So you can say, so you've imported age as a demographic characteristics. You can activate, say, documents of all individuals over 30 years of age. And it will then do that for you, so you can focus your analysis a little bit more. But we'll discuss some of those differences. Another benefit of adding variables, if you have a variable, as we'll see in a second, you can designate it as a favorite variable, and you can get these favorite variables to also display in your retrieved segment. So here's just a screenshot from one of my projects, one we'll be looking at in a minute. So if we look at my retrieved segments, you see here, it's where the arrow is pointing to. I have the age, I have a gender code, and then a couple of quantitative measures that I have for each of these individuals as well. So I like that. I use that feature quite often because, for one, when conducting mixed methods analysis, it's helpful to have that for iteratively going back and forth. if you're, say, following a thread, trying to understand patterns in more detail, or really for any analysis. If you just want to contextualize this segment of text before you read it and make sense of it, you can have that variable display as well. So let's go over to MAXQDA then. All right, here. We're going to start, so I'll come back to the Home tab, but we're going to come over to this Variables tab. So here you have lots of options for variables, and I'll really focus on document variables. So first, I'll ask for this list of document variables. So it was this first button in the upper left-hand side. So I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. This is, if you use SPSS, if anyone has, it's kind of like a variable view in SPSS, and there are corollaries and other statistics program. But this is a list of all variables that we have added to this particular project. The variables at the top here that appear in red, those are system generated variables. So for instance, when you see things like a paragraph, number of paragraphs, document group, document name, all of those kinds of things, those are all variables that MAXQDA adds to the file for you. When something was modified, who modified it. So all of these in red are system variables. All of these in blue are variables that I've added. And for this particular data set, I've imported those, and I'll show you in just a moment how you might be able to do that. So you can add a variable really easily. There's an icon here at the top. So it looks like these lines and sort of has a plus in the lower right-hand corner. If I click on that, it prompts me to add a new variable. So at this point, I can establish whatever I want. I'm going to just call it ethnicity. But again, it could be test scores, biological data, survey data, whatever you want. You can select the type, so what type of variable it's going to be. I'll just leave it as text for now. And then you can also specify if you have missing values that are coded. So for example, if you want to code something as maybe 999 represents missing, that will instruct when it comes to analysis to sort of ignore that, to not count it. So you can specify these missing variables. So I'll just click OK, and then we can see that this variable is added right here as a text variable. I can add another one, and let's say I'm going to call this let's just say it's from a survey and it's question 1, it's an integer. Again, I can specify missing values. When I've selected integer, it gives me a little bit more information, so I can specify if this is a categorical variable or if I'm treating it more as a continuous variable, so interval or ratio type of data, but I'll just click OK, and then again, we see that added. So where are your data? What do your data actually look like? There's a couple of ways to get to it, but it's called the data editor. So for one, within this list of document variables, I can click on this icon right here. So it sort of looks like a page with a page kind of within it. There's also a button back in the variables tab as well to get to that data editor, but I'll just come to it from here. And it really just looks like a spreadsheet. So to use the SPSS analogy again, it's sort of like what we looked at before was a variable view, and then this is your data view. So these are all of my documents that I have in this particular file. So it was a pretty large study. I think we had about 400 individuals. And then we have quantitative data for all of them. So age, some gender data, what site they were from, what degree they had, test scores. These were all students. And then we have this collection of items right here. We'll come back to this in a minute, but these are essentially post-test scores. Now, this was an intervention study that people went through really to improve communication in healthcare settings. And then finally over here, you see the variables that I've added, this ethnicity and QUAN. And right now they're all 999. They're missing because, that's what I specified. But I can come in here and I can edit these. I can type. So, I could specify, for instance, Haitian. I think I've misspelled that, but for Q1, I could come in here and again, I can type values and so on, and I can enter them manually that way. So that's a little bit of how you get to your document variables. You can also import document variables as well. So this little button right here, import document variables, it's going to allow you to navigate to a particular file that you want to import from. Now, a couple of things that are really important to remember when importing. The document group and the document name in the file you're importing from must match exactly. This is one of the most common questions that I receive from people who are trying to add variables. It's some kind of a issue with importing. And most often it's because it doesn't match perfectly. So one trick that I use in order to ensure that it's going to match is I sort of set up a test file by first exporting my document variables. So I'll show you what this looks like. So I'm going to export my document variables, and I am going to call this variables test file, and I will go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to try to navigate to this, hopefully, variables test file, and it should open up here in just a second in Excel. So it's exported, all of my variables that are added, but why I do this is because I want to see how this document group and how this document name appears. And I want to make sure then that I have this filled out correctly in my target file. So once you've done that, it should make the process of importing go quite a bit easier. So at this point, we can import document variables. You can navigate to whatever you want to bring in. So here's just one that I've set up for our purposes. So it found this new column, a new variable, and I called it test score. Not very imaginative, but that's what I call it for this purpose. It actually gives me an option to specify what kind of variable it will be, so the target type. It gives me a little preview of the data type, and then I will go ahead and click import at this point. And then I'll just scroll over here, and you can see this test score is the imported variable, and it is missing for a few of these, which I have coded. So I can then come back over to my list of document variables, and I can make other sorts of edits. So I can say that, a missing value is coded as whatever. And I could also specify that it's a favorite variable if I want to do so. So I have a few favorite variables checked. And while we're on the topic of favorite variables, I just want to show you how that appears within retrieve segments. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate some documents. So I'll just, randomly activate a few right here. And then I'm going to activate a code while we're at it as well, and its subcodes. I maybe have to activate a few more because maybe those codes haven't been applied. Here we go. All right, so at this point, you see in my retrieve segments, and I don't have a lot that have appeared, so I'll add a few more here. So I have 87 segments. So now as I'm looking at each one of these segments of text, we see the favorite variables that I've designated. So I see the age of the individual, the gender, and then these are post-test scores. So presence was 0.75. That was a rating of presence. I'm rating communication at this point. And then this overarching outcome rating, essentially. And these are coded as 0, 1, and 2. So I know what category those are correspond to. So I can scroll into my next one, and again, I can see this. So if you're not seeing the favorite variable in retrieve segments, there's this little icon at the top, and it's display favorite variable, and you can toggle that on and off. But again, I find that really helpful for mixed methods analysis, but even just for working with really any type of data, if I want to have those demographics display, and you can use it really however you want. It certainly doesn't have to be just demographics. While we're here, I'm also going to just show you a little bit of how you can activate by variable before we move on to the stats package and some of the other mixed methods features. So first, I'll just reset my activations. And then if I come down, I can do this in a couple of ways. So I can say activate by, so it's just a little icon at the top. I can also right click and I can say activate documents by variables. That's fine too. So this is a similar dialog for working with really many variables in MAXQDA. It's a standard dialog box that you'll see. So on the left side here are all of my variables, and to the right are these conditions that I specified that I want to activate. So I'll just clear the list now. And I'm going to come to the age field just because that's what I talked about before. And I'll bring this over, and then it's asking for a value. So I can specify that I want to activate just those who are 34 years old, for instance. Or I can say that I want to activate those who are 34 or older than 34. So I'll click activate, and then we see here, a few of these have activated. There weren't many in this data set. But we have 5 different documents across 2 groups, at least for these particular codes. So that's one way to activate. I also just want to mention one other thing too, is I activate documents by variable. I can establish a document set at the same time. So this can be really useful if you might want to be using this sort of in the future. Again, you want to really be able to easily activate without having to go into this dialog box and do so. Not that it's really a big deal, but so let's say here that I want to activate by site. So I'll bring site over, and I want a set for site 1. So I'll just create new set here. And then if we come down here, you see what it did is in my document sets, it created a document set called site 1. And I can just select activate. They're already activated. I can rename this to whatever I want. So now I'll just reset my activations here for a second. But I can easily go back into this and I can reactivate. I can say that I just want to activate site 1. But what I like about that is that you're doing it all at once. You're activating and you're creating the new document set at the same time. All right. So let me continue on at this point while that's running and talk a little bit about the stats module. All right. So why use the stats module? For one, this can be really helpful for any kind of mixed method studies that you might be conducting. You could use the stats module though just for quantitative data. You actually don't have to have related qualitative data to use the stats module. You can bring in external data. But if you are conducting a mixed method study, it's really nice because you can house all of your data in just a single program. You can save output for inclusion in reports. So as you're running different types of analysis, you can specify what you want to save along the way. And then it's really helpful for mixed methods analysis too. So, let's say you want to look at, conduct a statistical analysis, look at descriptives of all of the participants in the qualitative strand of a mixed method study. You can run that, or, you can do some basic inferential analysis too, looking at correlations or comparing groups. We'll look at those in just a second. That's really nice too because it allows you to really go back and forth between your qualitative and quantitative data. So for instance, if you're conducting your qualitative analysis and maybe a pattern emerges, you might then flip over to the quantitative data and test that. Or vice versa, you note something is statistically significant, maybe that'll lead you to go back to the qualitative data and analyze it from a new viewpoint. So some of the features in the stats module, as I mentioned before, you can use what are called internal variables. So these are all of those document variables that I just showed you, or you can bring in external data, and either of those work identically. It's just where the data are coming from that you're bringing in. You can conduct descriptive statistics, so things like measures of central tendency or variance. You can look at frequencies. You can run crosstabs, also known as contingency tables, and obtain a chi-square test at the same time. And then there are a few there's a slight typo, contingency coefficients, like a coefficient C or Kramer's V. There are a few inferential tests. You can conduct an ANOVA, correlation, different types. So Pearson, if you have continuous data, or if you have rank order data, Spearman. You can also run a coefficient alpha, also sometimes known as a coefficient alpha, for reliability analysis. So let's say you're doing a mixed method study that involves survey development, or you just simply want to run that reliability data on your survey. So I'm going to go over to MAXQDA in just a minute, and we're going to talk about how to use the stats module specifically. This is just kind of a worksheet, just like what we looked at before. It's a data editor, and we see something very similar in the MAXQDA stats package. So let me just go back to that for a moment. All right, so I'm going to come to stats. So it opens this ribbon here, and then it gives me options. I can start with all documents. I can just focus on activated documents. So let's say I wanted to just look at site one. I can start with just those in site one, or you can bring in an external file. But for our purposes, I'll go ahead and start with all documents. So again, this looks really just like a spreadsheet. It's your data editor. I can also see my list of variables, clicking this tab on the bottom, and I can see what's called an output viewer. And you can see that I have a lot of output in here. I'll just go ahead and clear this for our purposes. But I'll come back to the data editor. So let's go through a few of these different options. So for one, descriptive statistics. So you can obtain frequencies or descriptive. So frequencies, let's just say that I want frequencies of site and module. And module refer to whether this was the intervention or the control group. This is a randomized control trial. So I'll click OK. So then it produces my frequencies. And at the top here is a little menu option where I can cycle through the different variables that I've asked for the frequencies for. So here it is for site. I can also go to module, and then I can go back to site. So this, looks just kind of like a standard statistical output. It's really nice. It gives me each of these different sites, the frequency, the percent, a valid percent, so that's excluding missing data. I don't actually have any missing data in that particular variable. And then it gives me a cumulative percentage as well. So you can do other things while you're here. For one, it gives me an option if I want to see this as more of a chart. So I can click on chart view, and then this is just a simple column graph that it builds. I can then make some edits with this as well, but I'll just come back to this table view. So now what's kind of neat is that rather than just getting this list of a bunch of output, you can choose what you want to save in that output viewer. So that's what these little icons represent here on the right-hand side. It's insert into the output viewer. It's asking me, do I want to include descriptives? And I'll say, sure, we'll go ahead and include those. So now we see this saved in the output viewer. It's basically saving this. If I had a chart, I could also save that. If I want to just save everything for all the variables, I can click this other icon that has the two arrows going into it, and that will just insert all of those charts. You can also send this to your QTT worksheet if you have one, or if you want to create a new worksheet, you can send it there as well. So again, think about keeping that chain of evidence handy. You can do so by saving it over there. So that's frequencies. I'll just show a few more things. So let's look at descriptive statistics. Looks really similar to the others. I'll come to some of my quantitative measures right here, and I'll bring these over. It gives me options. So do I want the mean, standard deviation, variance? This is one thing that I really like about the stats package. It actually distinguishes between a sample standard deviation and variance versus a population standard deviation and variance. Because the formula is different. It's essentially whether you're dividing by n-1, so correcting for some sampling error. And then you can choose other things if you want a range, for instance, but I'll click OK just so we can look at these. So again, it just gives me this nice table of descriptives for all of my variables and then those descriptive statistics. And I'll just go ahead and save these in my output viewer. So just briefly, let's look at a couple of these inferential tests. So if I come to compare groups, I can run a crosstab, or I can run an analysis of variance if I want to compare groups. So let's say module is my factor, and remember that was the intervention or control group. And I want to compare this global score, so I'll grab that. and I will click OK. So then here it gives me, and this is published data at this point, and this agrees with what we found, but it gives me just kind of a standard ANOVA table at this point where you see your sum of squares, mean squares, my F value, that was statistically significant, and then we had this relatively small eta square as well. Again, you can choose to save this in your output. You could run multiple ANOVAs at once, provided it's appropriate, and that's what your research questions call for. So then let's look at one other thing, and that would be the Pearson correlation. So let's say that I want to look at whether these 4 different domains are correlated with one another. So I'll drag these 4 different domains in my post-test, and it gives me just a standard correlation matrix. And it's nice. It gives me my p-value in addition to my correlation coefficient in each of these. You can specify if it's a one-tailed or a two-tailed p-value, which again is nice. And then you can insert this into your output viewer, and it looks great. All right, so that's a really quick tour of the stats package. Let's now, so I close that. So it's basically saving all of that data and making sure that it's updated. Let's just look quickly at the mixed methods tab. And then we'll go over to the slides as well and go through some of those. But if we go to the Mixed Methods tab, it has some of those things I mentioned, activating documents by variables. What I'll talk about are the interactive quote matrix in the cross tabs. And then it has a few of these options on the far right-hand side. All of these are really helpful for kind of visualizing mixed methods data in conducting what I call a joint display analysis, or developing joint displays. That's a term used by several individuals, but it's a way to build matrices or tables or figures that really depict the integration of qualitative and quantitative data, and these tools can help you do that. So let me just share a couple of slides on what some of these are, starting with the crosstabs. So this, is a contingency table. You can look at codes by quantitative variables, and those could be just demographics. So this could be helpful for any kind of analysis, or it could be something like a quantitative variable. So maybe I wanted to look at that post-test outcome measure, and I want to know if my codes, how they're similar or different, based on that score, for instance. So here's an example where I've done that. So it looks like some of the other tools in MAXQDA, like a code relations browser, for instance. This is a list of all codes. It's from a different project. And then the columns are representing 3 different performance levels, actually. So this is nice because it allows us to think about this in a couple of different ways. So I can think about, in this case, it's the low, the middle, and the high performers. I can look down across these columns and try to identify if there are any patterns among the times codes have been applied. I can also take a particular code and look across rows. So think about, are there any differences? So this rapid response teams and the low performers relative to the high performers, it was coded much less frequently. Now, frequency alone might not tell you much, but it's indicating a potential pattern that you might want to explore. So when you're in the crosstabs, you can then look at the text behind those numbers and explore that in a couple of different ways. If you click on this, it will allow you to do so, but it will also allow you to use something called an interactive quote matrix. And you can access this from crosstabs, or you can access it just from the Mixed Methods menu. And this is that same data from the interactive quote matrix, where essentially I have all of these rows here in this little box as my codes. And then these columns represent those different performance levels. But here I can focus on a single code at a time. I can read through the segments of text and think about, based on my research question here, it was really what distinguishes high performers. So I'm able to consider what we learned code by code from the low, the middle, and the high performers to really think about what's similar and what's different among those. So it really makes this mixed methods analysis that you're doing much more systematic, in my opinion. You could do the same thing, through spreadsheets, but honestly, it would be much more cumbersome. This is one of my go-to features for mixed methods analysis that I use for virtually any mixed methods project that I'm conducting right now. So as far as this interactive quote matrix, why you would use it, it allows you to dynamically compare quantitatively different groups. So in this case, I grouped it based on those kind of, large buckets of performance, low, middle, and high, based on, could be tertiles, it could be based on the highest quartile, the two middle, and then the lowest, and it doesn't have to be just three. You can have more. I think you can have up to 8 different columns, I believe. Um, to do things like explaining variation or differences based on that variable. So it's not just simply the frequency, but maybe how people talked about something differently. But it really illuminates that and gives you a structured pathway for that sort of analysis. You can then capture segments that you might want to include in one of these visual joint displays. And some research questions that I think you could address, or why you might want to do this, for one, would be explaining variation on an outcome. So did the experiences of those who did really well differ from those who didn't do so well? Explaining variation in instrument development studies. So if we detected some individuals as maybe having very high scores in terms of, agency, for instance, their own personal agency, did the qualitative data reflect that as well? And similarly, for those scoring low, did their qualitative data reflect that? Or just if you want to compare themes on levels of any sort of a variable. That kind of takes us to this next feature, and we'll go to MAXQDA and look at my file in just a moment. But looking at qualitative themes by quantitative groups, so this is very similar to an interactive quote matrix. It's accessed from the Mixed Methods tab, but you can basically focus on some code, some specific codes, and then think about how you might see differences. And again, you can extract segments to develop a joint display. So this example right here is a published joint display from the data that we'll look at in just a moment. And honestly, I built this using the interactive quote matrix. That's what really led to this. I mean, of course, I was identifying patterns, and what you see here reduced into this single table is a very condensed version of all of the data that we went through. But I used it really to conduct this analysis, and we write up more about what our results were, and to build this particular table by grabbing some illustrative quotes that really showed how people who performed not so well versus those who performed really well in the intervention, how did they differ thematically? And honestly, these patterns would have been hard to note had I not conducted that particular analysis. So here's just one other example, looking at statistics by qualitatively different groups. So if you have different, rather than quantitative groups, but qualitatively distinct groups, say it's a topology, and you have different types, you can look at a statistical profile of each of those groups based on your document variables. And that's what you see right here. So you can think of, for people who fell into one group, so this cuts off a little bit, but they did really well in nonverbal cues. What were their test scores like compared to those who really emphasize more other forms of communication? What were their scores like? So again, it's another way of conducting that analysis. It's just sort of rotating it and looking at it at a different angle. Let me just go over to MAXQDA for a moment then before I conclude, and then we should have enough time for question and answer. So I just want to show a crosstab. So I'm going to open a crosstab, and for our purposes, I'm going to ask for just these 3 different categorical groups. And I should show right here. If you have, say, a variable and it's a categorical variable with 3 different values, rather than dragging each one over and saying I want level 1, level 2, level 3, you can click this button to insert all variable values as conditions. So that's what I did right here. So now it's going to give me columns for each of those different levels. Do I want this only for activated documents? I don't. I actually want it for all, and I will click OK. So it gives me this crosstab. So again, this is just a way to look at patterns. But if I want to look at the text behind this, I can now, from the crosstab, go straight to this interactive quote matrix. I could also build one from this button up here. But if I go to the interactive quote matrix here, I can really step through, and I'll turn my hierarchy back on of my code system. I can step through code by code, and I can then read through what individuals said, try to make sense of it. I have the source displaying, which is a hyperlink. So if I want to read this in context, I can click on this. It minimizes, I'll get this out of our way. It minimizes the interactive quote matrix. It took me to that particular document and that section of the document. And then I can come back to my interactive quote matrix and continue working. So I can read through all of this. I can then come down to my next code. So it's a really systematic way to go through it and step through it. With any reports in MAXQDA, you can of course export this, or you could save it as a Word file or an Excel file, for instance. And then these other features we looked at just briefly. So I had the statistics by qualitative groups. So we can bring a particular code with subcodes over here. So each of these subcodes are going to be a different group. So we'll just do a few of these for now, and then I can choose what document variables they want to display. So I'll just grab a few here for our purposes, just to show you what that looks like, and I'll click OK. And it builds this table. So it's looking at, again, these are based on a qualitative code. So think about if you have qualitatively distinct groups, what's a statistical profile of those individuals? So just to conclude here, a couple of tips for using the visual tools. Always think about your unit of analysis. It's foundational, related to any kind of research, but what is it? Is it a case, a document? Are you looking across documents? And make sure your data is set up appropriately. So if you have an interview for every individual and then variables for those individuals, that individual is your unit of analysis. Things like the code matrix browser and code relations browser can be helpful to look at patterns across documents, but really things like the interactive quote matrix and the crosstabs allow you to bring in additional quantitative data. And that could be used for mixed methods analysis, or it can be used for more of a basic sort of qualitative analysis too, if you're comparing based on demographics. All right. So I know I'm a little bit over, but I'd be happy to address any questions. So I'm just going to turn off my screen share for a moment and start to look through these. All right, so regarding the missing value, can MAXQDA treat white space as a missing value if it's imported? And that's really exactly what it did in that example that I showed. So I had blanks for a lot of those, and I said that I was going to code, I think 999 or negative 999 is missing, and that's what it did. So it just treated those as missing data. Another question, is there a way to modify the variables when imported from an external file? So imported literature data from EndNote, MAXQDA applied document variables, but I couldn't find a way to modify these. You should be able to modify, I'm wondering though, is that a system variable? That's a good question. If it's a system variable, it's harder to modify. I have to think about that for a second, honestly. So, normally if you come to variables and then if you come to your list of document variables, you can make a few edits, like you could change the name of a variable. You couldn't change the data type necessarily, just because that could be problematic, if you already have data stored and set up a certain way. If you come to your data editor, though, you should be able to edit any of those values. I would say that if it depends if they are system variables, and I want someone else if they can help. I just can't remember if it imports bibliographic data as a system variable. But let me just quickly go over to one of those sort of projects and see. Yeah, so it does import. So in this example here, I had data from EndNote. It did import it as a system variable. So those I can't necessarily change, but I did add variables for this particular project. Another workaround, you could export this, and then you could make modifications, and then you could import your changes as new variables. So that might be a workaround for you, but that's a good question. Um, let's see. But if it's not a system variable, you should be able to make those changes and edit values and that kind of thing. Question here, what's the best way to utilize mixed methods in MAXQDA? So it's to incorporate demographics in a survey along with quantitative data. For example, a certain percentage of participants with age groups, a certain age group mentioned a certain pattern from the qualitative data. So, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, I would probably turn to something like, maybe the interactive quote matrix, or if I'm understanding this right, looking at things like the statistics by qualitative groups might be a way to do that. So you can look at those patterns. Or similarly, if you have quantitatively distinct groups, so you want to compare different age groups, for instance, those could be, say, columns in a crosstab or in an interactive quote matrix, and then you could look for patterns across those variables. So it just depends on how you want to approach that. Can you make adjustments to your inferential? So, for example, a Bonferroni correction. I have not done that. I don't believe so. I don't think there are post hoc analyses in the ANOVA, but let me just double check on that. And I'm in the wrong data set, so I'm not sure how well this is going to work, but we'll go ahead and give it a try. But I don't think, yeah, I don't believe there is a way to conduct post hoc testing within here. I'll let you know if I come across a different answer, but I don't believe that that's currently a feature. Let's see. And then a question, where do we need to check and set the unit of analysis? So make sure that outputs are given the right unit of analysis. There's no way to really check it. I guess I would just think ahead of time about how you're setting up your data specifically. So, if you come to, this is a file right here, and this was from really a scoping review, a methodological review. Here, my unit of analysis was an article. So each of these are rows. If we come back to one of my other projects, the one we were looking at before, here, my unit of analysis was individual. So I basically had a document for every individual. And I'm always cautious about this because I've, had some issues in the past where maybe some people had a document set up by site, so kind of based on data collection site or type of data. And it makes it very hard to then tease that apart and really get to the individual level type of data that I needed. So, go back to your study and think about what's your unit of analysis. And then I would really ensure that your documents are really at kind of that lowest, that same level, that basic level for your unit of analysis. But that's a really good question. All right. I don't see any other questions. We have maybe just a minute or two left. I'd be happy to address any others that you might have. Let's see. Right, yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, really, really great to have you here. Hopefully this was helpful. And even though this is titled mixed methods features, I do just want to reiterate that I find those features in the mixed methods tab also very helpful for comparing based on demographics or comparing cases, if that's what you're doing, depending on what your analysis is. So it allows you to just dig a little bit deeper, really to address your research questions. But as far as the mixed methods analysis, really they're excellent, and I would have a hard time going back if these tools were not available to me. So. All right. If you do have any other questions or you have any issues with the slides or whatever, please email me. I just put my email in the chat, tguetter@umich.edu. Otherwise, if there are no questions, we can close. We're, I think, about a minute early. Thanks, Christina. Great to have you here. Utam, Janine, thanks. Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining, and I wish you a great rest of the conference. This is always fun, just a lot of information in digestible chunks. So again, feel free if you have any questions in the future, and thanks so much.